today I want to just welcome everyone, and Margie might want to say a quick welcome too as the museum committee chairperson. But I'm Sue Koletsky. I'm the museum director at the Temple Museum of Jewish Art, Religion, and Culture at the Temple-Tifereth, Israel. And today we are doing our fourth Zoom talk, Zoom Art Talk. We're going to be visiting with Larry Sisson, who is a conservator and also an installation master, I'm going to call him. I've been fortunate and privileged to work with Larry for years. We've had some great experiences hanging terrific shows together. His attention to detail and overall understanding of the creative spark is terrific. And also he can really do amazing conservation on a wide variety of objects. And his background is very, very solid. He will tell you about that in terms of how he got to where he is to be with us. Many of you know Larry, and I'm glad that he's here with us today. So Margie, do you just want to say a quick hello?
Quick hello. I'm happy to be with everyone too. And I'm glad we've been able to have art talks, you know, in these times. We need it more than ever. And Larry's got a lot to share with us. Looking forward to it very much. And hi to everybody.
Thanks, Margie. So the way that we do these art talks is, as you know, if you've been into one before, is that these are very informal, and that's what we love about them. And the presenter kind of talks a little bit, and then we'll ask if we have any questions or thoughts. You can always write in the chat box, and Jen Mendelson, who's our fabulous hostess or host today from the temple, can see those, as can we, and we can address them. You can raise your hand. We'll all be on mute, but we want to have this a lively interchange as well. So without too much to do, I want to just introduce Larry.
Good. Hello, how are you all? So I do know many of you, which is a real treat. And under these circumstances, it's a nice thing to be able to see each other safely and all that sort of thing. I'm a conservator. I've worked in the field of art and archaeology for, gosh, how many years now? Well over 25 or so. I started off working on digs in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Cyprus, in Israel, on the West Bank. I did a year working with the Israel Antiquities Authority on conservation things dealing with mosaics mostly. But I started off at a very young age, actually, with dealing with materials and history and archaeology. I was probably 5 years old when I first visited Petra in Jordan. We were living in Amman where my father was working. And this sort of fascination with objects goes back a long ways. But along, through history, through my life in this sort of been exposed to fixing things, repairing things from walls to clocks to all kinds of things. But art has always been an area that I've been interested in because it kind of tells something about who we are as people, what our cultures are like, where they come from, and also the interchange of ideas. It's an interesting and really wonderful field, and many different facets to it. And in that, I thought it would be interesting to talk about what it is that if you have questions about conservation, what it does, or where it comes from or what it does, or also how it applies to one's own private things. I think these are absolutely legitimate questions. So if you want to ask something along the way, please don't hesitate to do so. I don't have a written script here, so I don't have to follow any one particular path of information. But let's start with this. In 1995, I started working with the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem at the Rockefeller Museum doing mosaic conservation. And this was an internship that involved working in the field with a team of about 6 or 7 crew people, and then also under the supervision of a number of different site supervisors. And we would go from one site to another, evaluating the mosaics that they were either unearthing or that needed to be removed if it was a salvage excavation. Salvage excavations are those where some sort of project is going on that where we can't leave the mosaics in place. So we'd actually have to lift the mosaics and take them to a storage area. And these were new skills for me. And it was a very interesting and really wonderful way to get introduced to conservation, where one is in the process of taking artifacts and preserving them in conditions that would have been, well, either save them or lose them sort of situations. And fortunately, the resources were there to allow us to save them. And that's often a question that needs to be addressed very directly, is what kind of resources is one willing to put towards the preservation of artifacts? What's the value in them? And conservators are always usually of the mind that things are worth preserving, especially things that are important to us. And what makes something important to us is either we use them, we have relationships to them, we know people who are related to them, and so on and so forth. And preserving those sorts of aspects of an object is a facet. It's not just the metal or just the glass, the ceramics we're trying to preserve, but also often the history of it. And that can be manifested in wear and tear. It can be manifested in alterations. For instance, if something was painted. So there's a lot of decisions that go along into doing conservation. But that was my start, working on mosaics in the West Bank and so on. And after that, I went to London, where I worked at the Institute of Archaeology in London, where I did a 3-year degree that ended with a master's in conservation. And after that, I came to the States, where I worked in New Mexico with the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe, where I worked with Indian artifacts, as well as a lot of folk art materials. Then I came to Cleveland to work at the museum as their Mellon Fellow in Conservation. And I worked at the museum for almost 10 years before I went independent. Children and a far too busy travel schedule made it an interesting, I think it was the right choice at the time as well, to spend more time at home, as well as just develop those sorts of relationships. And one of the wonderful things, okay, no, that's good. Was getting to know Sue. And Sue and I have been working together with the museum for quite a while, a number of different projects. Now, Jen, why don't we go to the first slide, and I'll talk you through a conservation project and use it to describe some of the processes involved in making decisions. So let's go to the second, yeah, there we go. This is a 5th century Japanese storage vessel that is owned by the old curator from the Museum of Japanese Art, Japanese and Korean art. And he and I have worked on repairing a number of pieces that he's been slowly moving into different collections around the country, usually museums and the sort. This is a piece that was broken. You can see in the upper left-hand image a large gray area. That's a missing piece. And then you can see that the way the process goes is you're given, a few dozen different pieces. You fit them together without glue to see how well things fit together. And you develop a plan on how you want to glue them up. Once you do that, you take it apart and you exercise the plan and you put the part together. And the interesting things that go along in here is because these shapes are irregular, you can't always count on them fitting in properly. You can lock pieces out where if you put 3 pieces together, the 4th piece doesn't fit in. So there's a strategy to this. So this is why we lay things out and work slowly. But once you start gluing them together, depending on what kind of adhesive you use, the process may have to go quickly. It may have to go slowly. And you choose the materials related to these sorts of issues. Now, this one went together pretty well, just a large missing area. I was able to make a fill, as you can see in that upper left-hand image, and then the other cracks and small losses. Oh, let's not go there yet, because that's the punchline. Let's go back, Jen, 2 more.
All right, my
Yeah.
computer is having some issues here. Hold
No
on one
worries.
second. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yep.
And so we go back through this process, and you make the
There we
pot, you put it together, and then sometimes, as is the case, the missing piece is discovered almost 6 or 7 months after I actually did the repair. And that's what the next image is. This is an image I was sent about a week ago by Michael, telling me that he'd found the piece in his closet wrapped up in tissue paper. So he's sending me the piece, and all of that work that was done repairing it the first time is going to have to be undone to some degree or other, so I can put this piece back in. So as part of any plan, something might go wrong, and you have to sort of somewhere leave that back door so you can take things apart and put them back together again. And that's a question of reversibility. In conservation, it's actually a very important one, because these sorts of issues do occur with some frequency, especially with archaeological things, because excavations are ongoing and pieces can be found. And if there's enough value in what you're doing, they'll want to put as much of the original piece together as they can. This isn't a study piece so much as it is an artifact. Now, I'm going to take the pot apart and put that piece back in and pretty much start over again. But it's an example of why it's important to use materials in conservation that are reversible. You don't want to change something in such a way that you can't remove what you've done. That separation of your intervention from the integral object is an important concept in conservation. Let's go on to the next image.
Okay.
So along with the repairing and fixing things, obviously, actually, yeah, hold on. I'm not going to talk about this quite yet. I want to go into another point about this reversibility thing. In artifacts, and by artifacts, you know, they're contemporary artifacts, they're ancient artifacts, they're historical artifacts. And the difficult part of most of this is identifying what's important in this artifact. It's not necessarily a given. For instance, let's say Judaic is a very good example of it, especially given the nature of these objects that are cherished by families and travel with families, and as a result are damaged in the history and the movement of these things. Sometimes this damage is integral to the story. And in the process of repairing and cleaning, this history can be lost a little bit. So we have to identify the aspects of these objects that are important. If you can say that this was, you know, something that your grandmother had dropped while she was putting it in a cupboard, as opposed to something that was buried to be saved and damaged in excavation, these sorts of storylines become important, and they need to be tied into the objects in a very real way. And that's part of the process of curation that, you know, that Sue and anybody involved in this kind of history preservation, if you will, need to deal with quite directly. So go ahead. Is there a question? No? Okay. Sorry, I thought I heard somebody say something. These sorts of questions are important things to identify from the beginning. So the other part of this, of course, is the presenting of objects. We deal in conservation with how to store objects, how to present objects, how to preserve objects. And is part of that is also how to tell the history of the object. But the real profession that deals with telling the history are the curators. Let's go to the next image and talk about the presentation of objects. Okay, these are a pair of Egyptian pieces. One is a Roman Egyptian head, and the other one is I think, I can't remember the exact term, but it's a small piece of, the cat is a bit of plaster relief. It's actually a remarkable piece that belonged to a private collector, and he wants to mount them. So this is one of the processes we go through, is ways of making mounts that don't damage the pieces, so to speak. Now, what often happens with heads and pieces like this that are three-dimensional is they are drilled from the underside, and a post is put through them to hold them upright. This obviously is a risk. You can always break something. And two, you're drilling a hole into an ancient object, which of course in of itself is a potential problem. So here on the left two images, you'll see the head inset into a carved socket that was made to match the underside of the head. So it actually sits in there very firmly. We stylized the base a little bit to look like these Renaissance bust, or almost, I mean, if anybody's familiar with ancient art, these Hermes, which were these little stands with heads of usually male heads in the sort, and then other attributes attached to it as well. But and the next one over is the cat, and that again is plaster with large aggregates of stone inside it. So drilling into that would be a pure disaster, because the chances of it just falling apart is very real. But then coming up with a mount, and I should have used an image that could actually show you the mount, but essentially it's on a slight backwards angle and is supported from the side and underneath. So it almost forms a cup. Let's go on to the next one, and I'll show you two more mounts that are being in the process of being made. Okay, these again, both Egyptian. One is a limestone head, the other one is a plaster lion's head. Oh no, it's not plaster. I'm sorry. It's I think it's a sandstone. And here again is these types of pieces would normally be mounted on a post. And again, drilling into these objects makes a hole where one doesn't need to be, and other ways of dealing with it, but also finding aesthetic ways of matching woods or using complementary types of materials become useful. And it can be it's a very fun process. Let's go on to the next slide. And from there, we're going to talk about some pieces that are from the museum. Sue, what can you tell me about this piece in terms of its history and where it came from?
Sue, you're muted.
I think.
Okay, I got it. So
Okay.
there it is. Sorry about that. So this is a teak, and the Torah Scroll is placed into this kind of a, I don't want to call it a cabinet, but a container for a Torah Scroll. And the Torah is read from this. It's not taken in and out. And usually there are some, in this one is a case that does not have a Torah in it, but at the Maltz Museum, we have a teak that is sterling silver and also has velvet on it, and that there is a Torah in there. And you can see that it fits pretty snugly. You're able to put your fingers at the top so that you can actually twist the rods there, or the staves rather, so that you can move the scroll. But the teak is used primarily more in the Middle East. Like when I was in India, they use teaks basically because of the climate and also the culture. It's just instead of in the Ashkenazi way is usually to have the beautiful fabrics that we have on our Torah scrolls, and teaks is just another way of protecting on preserving the scrolls.
Okay, cool. Now, my relation to this is a very different one. I look at it in terms of the materials, but also trying to be sensitive to what the thing is used for. Looking at this, I would identify this as a wooden structure with a decorative laminate over the surface with bone and other materials used as inlay, with a velvet lining, probably with some sort of textile below it, and then this cording. It's a very different relationship ensues to this object. But what I'm trying to do when I'm looking at this is to identify the types of materials that were used, how they're put together, and how to stabilize them if there are issues with the stability of it, in which case they were. This piece had been damaged in some flooding that took place in the basement. And as a result, there was some areas of loss of the inlay, as well as other elements of it. So what we're looking at here are photographs of the in-process restoration of it. What had happened is, I don't think you can see, but if you look at the left image, you'll notice that there is on that front edge, the top half of it is a good bit whiter than the bottom half. That little strip of bone had been lost. And if you look at the image in the middle, you'll notice as an image shot from the side, and you'll notice again that white edge, the trim, and a little bit of white at the very, not the very top of it. This is a material that I use to replace the missing bone. It's of a slightly different color, but it can be toned down. If you look at the image on the right, you'll notice that it's a little less apparent because of a little bit of cleaning and also a little bit of integration. But when you look at this piece in person, in real life, there's this little rule in conservation. It's called the 6 foot 6 inch rule. The idea being that when you're about 6 feet away from it, the restoration shouldn't be obvious. It should be really very subtle. You shouldn't see it that clearly. But when you get up to about 6 inches, you should be able to see the difference between the original piece and the restoration. It just helps you tell the story a little bit more clearly about what is original and what is not. Now, the degree to which this is pushed can be quite substantial. Sometimes you need a microscope to see the differences. Sometimes sometimes you have to use an X-ray machine to see the difference. When I was at the museum, we were asked to do assessments of objects that the museum wanted to buy. And it's remarkable the types of things you would find when you look at them closely. There was one small Buddha figure that we had that was it was sort of plaster on top of wood. When we put it under the when we put it under X-ray, because we were seeing this odd kind of layering, that there was another figure just below the surface that was significantly different from what was on the outer surface. So this piece had been restored and then probably restored again. Question is, was the restoration a restoration to make the piece look better than it was, or was it restoration that took place in a temple that was trying to preserve it? You know, these are the kinds of things you end up playing with or running into. They're not things you want to play with, they're things you want to consider seriously. So hiding things too well or obscuring restoration is not seen as being a good thing. It's something you want to be able to identify, and it's usually a good idea if you have some kind of record, if you're the ones who are actually doing it, of having it done. Let's go on to the next slide, which are some more images of the same teak. Okay, here is an example of trying to preserve as much of the original piece as we can. The felt lining on the base had been attached to a paper core and had been really quite badly worn and had detached slightly because of the flooding. Now, there is always the option, especially when dealing with these sorts of materials of finding a similar material and simply replacing it, which was something we considered closely, but we felt that the original material was in good enough condition and integral enough to the piece that we should do our best to preserve it. So the paper core was pretty much beyond being able to use. It had warped and had torn in a number of different ways that made it impractical to use it, but the felt was still in good enough condition that it could be reused. But you can see a few small holes along the edges. But what we did is we stretched it over a new piece of card and used tacks that were similar to the tacks that were already in there to reattach it to the edge. We didn't glue it down as it had been glued down originally, because of the very simple reason that if we had glued it down, it's much more difficult to remove if we decided we had to. And those were the decisions there. We used the original felt, we put it on a new core, we tacked it down with using similar, if not the same tacks as before. Many of them had been rusted to the point that they couldn't be reused, but those that were still in good shape were reused, and so on. So let's go on to the next image.
One second here, Larry.
No worries, Jen.
Oops, just let me know when it's the correct slide. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so here's a series of sort of in-process photographs. You can see the losses here on the left, one piece going in on the next piece, the second piece going in on another one, and then the finished image on the far right. Again, from a distance, it doesn't jump out at you, but when you get up close to it, you can see what is original, what is not. And what's nice about this is when you look at the piece, it is a pretty remarkable object. I mean, the amount of work, the inlay is quite stunning. And when you have these losses, they detract from the overall beauty of the thing. So doing these sorts of repairs, while not necessarily are always about, how do you say, consolidating, and maybe I should explain the difference between consolidation and restoration. That's a good thing to do. All right, consolidation is when you see weaknesses in an object. For instance, if areas of the inlay are separating from the wooden core and it can break off. Consolidation would be injecting or introducing a adhesive into the void between the outer layer and the core and re-adhering it. So those pieces are not separate. You can't see it. It doesn't change the appearance of the thing, but it makes that surface firmly attached to the core, not likely to fall off. That's consolidation. In this case, what we're looking at is restoration, an area that is missing, that is visible, and we're putting a new fill into it to make it look less damaged, and essentially more beautiful. Now, one can say there is an element of this that is about consolidation because you're protecting these broken edges. That would be a consolidation issue. Filling a missing area, that's a restoration issue. An important issue, difference to note. Okay, let's go on to the next image. Another bit of restoration that we did at the temple, again related to flood damage. Here's I believe these are ossuaries. So am I right about that? I think you're still muted, but I think you said yes. Yeah, good. So in this case, when these pieces were being taken out of the basement to protect them, some damage had occurred to the back end of this. Now, what was interesting about this is most of the area that was damaged is actually restoration. It's mostly fiberglass that had been used to restore the piece and to help tell the story of what the object looked like when it was whole. That happens a lot with the archaeological objects where they're missing elements that are important to understanding the integrity of the original piece. And so they're restored using different types of materials, in this case, fiberglass. So none of the original ceramic was actually damaged, but the piece is damaged. So here we are just again, consolidating, readhering some of the broken areas, and then filling and integrating the areas of damage. And on the lower left, you can see my palette. On the lower right, you can see the restored area, which is the upper right-hand corner of that tail. So these are kinds of things that we try not to have to do because something bad has happened. But when we do them, we like them to look good. Now, again, if you got up close enough to this thing, probably more than 6 inches, you could see the restoration because the cracks are still there. But they're pretty well integrated. Does somebody have a question?
I do, Larry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that this actually is a piece that's a reproduction from the Israel Museum that we got probably in the 60s. We have quite a few of these pieces that are archaeological. So this was especially good that you were able to, restore this piece for our.
Is it a reproduction or is it a piece that has been repaired? Because I'm looking at those panels, those look like proper ceramic pieces that have been glued together.
We'll have to take a look at it more carefully, but I thought it was a reproduction from the Israel Museum. We have many of those. But anyways, whatever, you're absolutely right. That part of it was always a piece of fiberglass.
Yeah.
And that needed to be restored.
Yeah, but I'm quite sure that the main body of it is actually ceramic. So I would think it's actually repaired. The thing about, I've been in the stores at the Israel Museum and I've been through, they have many hundreds of these things and they're all slight variations on them because they're all hand built and they're stunning. And the fact that you have one in your collection is quite remarkable. They're quite neat.
Good.
They are fun things. Good. Let's go on to the next image. Completely different thing.
Larry, I had a question too.
Yeah.
Just in general, the flood has been mentioned twice now.
Yeah.
Was there a tremendous, I remember that flood and it was like kind of a human chain of people getting stuff out.
Yes.
Was there a lot of damage?
There was, well, Sue could probably respond better than I to the extent of damage, but my sense was that you guys had been really very good in preserving as much of it as you can. There was some water damage, but most of the materials were boxed, and those that weren't boxed were on shelves. So the actual amount of damage was relatively small. If these objects hadn't been boxed, if they had been out on shelves, the amount of damage would have happened, especially to things like textiles and works on paper, would have been devastating. So the fact that you had most of that stuff in pretty good conditions. Now, being dumped on with water is challenging for anything, but under the circumstances, I think we dodged a bullet, but we did it with planning. As I said, most of the stuff was boxed, which was great. Sue?
Right. Thanks, Larry. That's true. Everything, there was just water on the floor, basically. Luckily, it didn't come a lot from above. So I think this piece was actually damaged in transport going back up and downstairs, and that's how that happened. And the other piece, it was primarily the bottom, that red textile that got a tiny bit wet, and we needed to address it. So those were the major things. Everything is now elevated. We have, lots of different things in place to make sure that this won't happen yet again. But we had financing to fix these things. So from insurance money from the flood. So we didn't really have a whole lot of damage. It was more moving things from place to place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. All right. So in terms of preserving things, this is you probably recognize these chairs from the old temple or the old main room. They had been reupholstered, probably in the same style as the original ones, but the wooden sections of the bottom had been damaged. This was a curious project. I think I did for Chris, or was it you, Jen, who asked me to do this? I can't remember. But it was remaking the bottoms of the chairs to match the original legs. it may not sound like a restoration project, but in terms of the history and the objects within your own temple, they do have some significance. There's a familiarity to them, and they're part of the history of your temple. And doing things like this help preserve these things. You know, it's when you may decide you want to keep them in the future. You may decide they're terribly outdated or they're broken, but these sorts of decisions to maintain elements of your temple are tied into the same things that we deal with antiquities. They're just not that old yet, but we still have an interest in preserving them. Let's go on to the next slide. The presentation of objects within your, and these shows. This was one of my favorite installations that we did at the temple, which was the shoe show, as I like to call it, with the young artist from Tel Aviv, coming up with clever ways of putting these, I can't call them everyday objects because they're not everyday objects. You don't see shoes like this every day. And I think that was part of the charm of it. But at the same time, presenting them in a way that spoke to almost the shoe shop commodity aspect of it, and yet at the same time gave these objects the life that they deserve. So these are the kinds of things. Now, the temple, when they built their new gallery, I think put a lot of effort into thinking about ways of displaying things that give us the flexibility to put shelves or hang shelves and present objects in novel ways. And this is a good example of that. These hanging shelves, for instance, use a wire and caliper system that is relatively rare in the States, but is becoming more and more not available because it's still hard to get these materials, but prevalent in commercial spaces. You'll see these sorts of things in some of the higher end shops. But the interesting thing is integrating them into a gallery environment and using them in that environment is an aspect of conservation or collections care that is, I think, very relevant and very important to consider, because you're using a technology that allows you to do different things, and as well to do things in a way that maybe in the long run require fewer resources, in the sense that by not putting holes in things, you don't have to repaint them, or you can use elements, take them in and take them out without materially damaging anything. In other words, they are truly reusable. Let's go on to the next image. Okay, here's another more recent exhibit where you can see the same hanging system used with frames. And this purple wall had been reused, I think, for maybe 2 or 3 shows, Sue? I can't remember.
Yes.
And one of the reasons we were able to use that same wall without having to repaint it is because we had used this hanging system. It doesn't require us putting holes in the wall, which require patching and painting. So in that aspect, this sort of a system, while expensive in the first run, does begin to pay for itself. But it also requires us to make, we have to be clever in how we hang things. You'll notice on the image on the right, the wires passing into the tops of the frames and then disappearing behind them. This thing thus allowing us to hang one directly below another. In the middle image, you can see exactly how that display looked, with the wires coming straight down to the tops of the frames. On the image on the right, you can see another one of these frames hanging that way, and you can see, if you look carefully at the diagonal across the top, you might be able to see the rail and the hardware from which the wire comes down. Okay, let's go on to the next one. I feel that I'm taking up more time talking and not answering questions, but let's do this quickly. Here's another thing that we do. In this case, we have these large books. This is in the, is this the current exhibit? No, this is the previous.
Yes. No, this is the current one.
Okay. Displaying objects. In this case, this book of what are these called again, Sue? I'm sorry.
Ketubot.
Ketubot. Yeah, this book of Ketubot, and presenting it vertically so you can see them. We had to build this frame that you can see on the left. There's much more involved in putting together an exhibit than simply putting things on shelves. How they're supported and how the pages are held, how the bindings are held, so to cause the least amount of stress to these objects so they can be used over and over again, is an important part of collections care and effective display. Okay, one more exhibit piece. Okay, these two textiles were just installed. Simple enough, except that it's a curved wall, and you can see that at the top of the picture. And hanging things on curved walls is notoriously difficult. But what we did here, because they are textiles, is we took a piece of Velcro, attached it to a flexible board, which was then mounted to the wall, and then the pieces were laid on top of that. This involved using a textile conservator to attach the Velcro to the textile, and then Maya do the installation in the space. The image on the right, again, getting to the issue of display. Things are always done in advance. The blocks are laid out. The sizes of the blocks are decided upon. The pieces are covered. There's a lot of decision making that goes into this, and taking the time to do it is important, and having the space to do it is important, but it also leads to an installation that is not just like good to look at, but is well considered. Let's go on to the next slide. And I'm starting to move more quickly, and I apologize for that. Let's talk about the storage of pieces. These ribonim were, when I first saw them, were quite heavily tarnished. And so one of my first jobs was to clean these things. Once they were cleaned, they were taken back into storage. They were eventually boxed and also stored in these brown, what we call corrosion intercept bags. These bags are filled with copper particles that will essentially react with pollutants that cause corrosion, and therefore those pollutants don't get into the silver and cause the same amount of corrosion. They're a very useful element, and the nice thing about this is I don't have to clean these ribonim any more than absolutely necessary, which is rare, but it also means you get to use them in a relatively good state. Let's go on to the next image, which will be more of these. Okay, these are more contemporary pieces. Again, you can see the boxes, the plastic, and then the pieces. I don't think that there's a whole lot more to say about that, actually. So let's go on to the next image. As in all things, the collection is large, and we haven't done all of them. So I wanted to show you what some of the storage is like, and know that in the process of cleaning them, they are going into the proper bags, but they all haven't been done. And the nice thing about this is a decision that is not a question of resources. Well, it is actually, but on another level, it's a decision that makes sense. Once an object is tarnished, when it's silver, it's not going to tarnish anymore. That surface is actually quite stable, and those objects are not going to deteriorate any further than they have already. Once they've been cleaned, they have to be wrapped in these films and stored properly. But until that moment, they are absolutely fine in this condition. So this is a decision more about using your resources to deal with pieces when you need to use them, as opposed to we've got to get everything clean.
Larry?
Yeah.
While you're talking about silver,
Yeah.
what do you recommend, when we're at home polishing our Kiddush cups and whatever that we have?
Well,
what do you think is best?
Well, it depends on the object itself, but I am a proponent of using dips if you can clean them properly. I mean, rinse off the material, because while the dip will get you a silver surface, the surface itself is not a very polished one. So a combination of dipping and then polishing with a rouge cloth, which is a jeweler's cloth, and then washing it with soap and water and drying it thoroughly for simple wears will work quite well. Now, the problem, of course, is by doing that over and over and over again, you wear through your silver, but that's over decades usually. Most people aren't going to wear through silver that fast, but most of our silver is relatively old. Now, if the piece doesn't need to be dipped, and the only reason I dip pieces is because the surfaces are complicated, or there are, for instance, if you look on the right, some of these spice boxes are all filigree. You can't polish filigree. You have to dip it, and then you can go through it and slowly polish the surfaces you can get to. But most polishes are somewhat caustic, i.e. they have a high pH, and that can damage not just the metal over time, but other elements of the piece as well. If it's just straight silver, you're probably going to be okay because you can wash it. But the important thing here is when you're polishing is to make sure you remove all of the sediment that you can, whether it's polishing compound or the material you dip it in. The washing of the silver is important. Yeah, because there are tools that conservators use that allow us to clean more thoroughly, if you will. But the vast majority of the polishing that takes place, even with conservators, involves a lot of elbow grease. It is a mechanical process.
Larry,
Your question?
yeah, well, two things. One, somebody else asked what exactly, what is dipping? What do you use? Do you have a product? But I also wondered otherwise, do you have any particular products to recommend for cleaning?
Well, yeah, the material I use is a material that isn't, it's often listed as an ingredient in silver dip. It's a material called thiourea. And I'm trying to remember exactly what it is. But essentially when you're silver dipping something, you're essentially using a electrochemical reaction that reduces the corrosion product back to silver, and it takes the sulfur, it complexes the sulfur out of the corrosion product. It's a chemical process, and most silver dips that you use will have some amount of thiourea in it. Now, the stuff that I use, I believe that I bought most recently is something called Godden's Silver Dip, Godens. And you can get it in different quantities. I don't usually dilute it, but it can be diluted. But the only reason to dilute it is to make it last longer, but then the reaction is slower. You do have to pay attention to how long you leave something in a dip. And I would probably recommend not any longer than you absolutely have to, which is look at it, take it out, clean it, and so on. Now, when you're dealing with hollowware like candlesticks, especially ones that have weighted cores, understand that those are often ceramic or some kind of porous material that's inside them. Those should not be dipped for the obvious reason that the likelihood of your object being watertight is relatively low, and the silver dip can be absorbed into that core, and eventually that will cause problems. Okay, so if you're dealing with hollowware like that, do pay attention to not dipping it and just go the rouge cloth. Rouge cloths can be bought online, and they're described as rouge cloths, and they consist of a cloth that's been impregnated with a very, very fine abrasive that you're essentially using. So all of these processes, except for silver dipping, of course, is an abrasion through a corrosion product. The silver dipping is a reduction process that chemically changes a corrosion product into its different components, one of which is silver. And that's why they come out looking nice and bright. Any questions about that? Now, one of the reasons I often do silver dipping on things like this is because in the end, it's much better for the client because it takes much less of my time. And the product in itself, I think, in my experience, is a good one. Now, the interesting thing is, through this cleaning process, you sometimes lose some of the detail. A lot of these pieces have incised designs that are hard to read when they're bright silver. And so in that sort of a situation, when you're cleaning it, you try to leave behind a little bit of the corrosion in the deeper interstices of the design, so that contrast helps you see the design better. So these are decisions you can make in the cleaning process. Any other questions? We've almost got an hour, so I've taken up way too much time. You are absolutely right, Sue. This time disappears. Absolutely disappears. So let me stop. I was going to talk a little bit more about the collection and other things we have in the basement in terms of the textile storage. Let's move on to the next two slides quickly, just so you can see them. Okay, so this slide here is this little incense box, spice box, I think you call them.
Yes.
This is one that we cleaned for an exhibit. On the left is its storage container. We wrap it up in one of these bags, we leave it in there. And it's still probably as bright as the day we put it in there, and it will remain that way for a while. So let's go on to the next slide. Next slide are photographs of the storage area. You can see the shelving units that are in place, the boxed labeled pieces, some of these, and just to give you a sense of what's going on there. We have a couple pieces. You can see that little ossuary on the floor, along with what looks like a small little altar to the left of it. And then an odd chair up there on the right. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, and this is the last thing. This is the temple's collection of textiles, and there's the way they're stored. This is something we did when we moved the collection downstairs, and it's been, I think Sue would agree, this has been a really nice element in terms of keeping things, the accessibility of it and the functionality of it has been really quite great. And the temple is the only place that has anything like it. So it's one of those little projects that I did for the temple that I'm most proud of in terms of how well it functions and how it's used today. And I'm going to stop there. I'd like to answer questions if anybody has any.
So Larry, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. All right. There we go.
I had a question about conservation, or a kind of repair. Some of the things you showed, they had a very small percentage of the item needed, in essence, to be fixed.
Right.
Is there like an ethical question that if something is so damaged and you have to repair so much of it, it like almost becomes like it's a fake, that because you've had to repair so much of it? How do you think about that in your field?
Well, my general feeling is there enough of the object left behind to tell a story? And is that story you're telling anywhere near the truth of what the object is? In other words, how much are you making up? And I've seen situations where you make up a lot. And in that case, the story is more about the story than the object. Now, is that illegitimate? To some degree, yeah, because you're kind of making it up. But on the other, if you have enough of the object that you can extrapolate what the object is, it becomes a way of visualizing the thing. If you were to say this is the real deal, that would be dishonest. But if you were to say that this is a good representation of what the thing is because of what we know, that would be fair. It's not this is real, this isn't. It's not like if you have 51% of the object, it's real, and if you have 49%, it's not. It's really a question of what do you know and how do you extrapolate from that, all right? It's an interesting thing about archaeology. You can get just the handle of a certain form and know what the whole form probably looked like just because of the history of the thing. People know that, oh, that's a Terra Sigillata Opus 42 or something of the sort, and it looked like this, and because of the drawings of the sort. and they'd probably be right if they were good at it, but not everybody's good at it. And so history, you know, this is one of the things about history is you gotta look at the details, never take it at face value. So does that answer your question, Marlene? Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I asked
Yeah.
a question on the chat, but I don't know whether it got, I wondered what you do with old brass. Do you try to bring it up to a real bright look? Do you use a brasso on it? What do you use to clean it?
Well, this is interesting. Old brass is, the thing about brass as opposed to silver, the corrosion on brass is much harder, just mechanically harder than silver, just nature of the oxide. But that doesn't mean you don't try and polish it. But the polishing process is much more aggressive. You can use brasso, but it's a pretty abrasive system, but it works relatively quickly, and that's why people like to use it. There is another material that's often used by conservators, something called whiting, and it's also used in other fields, but essentially it's chalk, calcium carbonate, which is much softer than the material in brasso, but it will eventually wear through the corrosion products, but it takes a lot of elbow grease. And as with silver and brass, you need to remove all of that paste from the surface, or else it will lead to further corrosion, because those powders act as corrosion sites if they're left in the grooves and the interstices of the object. You'll often see pieces of silver and brass that have corrosion happening in the deep recesses, but not on the surface. And often that's because the corrosion product has been left in those deep recesses. And the other part about that, there's often a little bit of chlorine mixed into materials like brasso. Chlorine and copper alloys like brass, that's a chemical reaction. That's an electro reaction that will almost always produce a pitting corrosion, a corrosion that actually eats into the metal. That's a good thing to note. Corrosion is one of the things I'm interested in. There are corrosions that form surfaces, and there are corrosions that eat into the metal. And they're very different processes, and they're very different chemicals. The ones that form surfaces often form protective surfaces, like tarnish on silver. But when you see corrosion like rust, where the reaction actually eats into the grain of the metal, those are much more damaging to the object. Tarnish isn't terribly damaging. Rust is. When you see blue and green corrosion products on brass, those are penetrating corrosion products. When you see your brass going a darkish brown, that's a surface oxide, and it actually is a protective oxide. So when you clean something, especially in the way of copper, you have to really want it to be polished and clean, and you're going to be doing it forever. But if you're okay with that nice dark surface, leave it alone. You know, that's one of the reasons that bronze sculpture, most of them are rather dark and brown, because that corrosion surface that they form is a protective one. And that's why a lot of outdoor sculpture is that color. It's a patinated surface. It's chemically produced, but it forms a protective surface. Does that answer your question?
Yes, because I have an old brass menorah from, like,
Yeah.
a couple of generations back in Germany, and there's some in the collection that look just like it.
Yeah.
And I've worked on it every Hanukkah. Before Hanukkah every year, I get this thing out, I get the brasso or something, and I try to make it bright, and it lasts about 8 days. And then it starts going, dark again. And I've been tempted, after a while, I was like, oh, maybe you should just leave it alone.
Yeah. Well, that does open up another thing that I could tell you about. As far as the cleaning of the object is concerned, elbow grease, and a lot of elbow grease. If you want it to stay shiny, you got to polish it. But there are products available that are what they call sacrificial or coating products that you can use on copper alloys like brass that will protect the surface from oxidation. It will slow the process down even significantly. but it also changes the texture of the surface. It has a slightly plasticky look to it. But it does keep the brightness of the brass longer. Only problem is it does get dark eventually. And when it does get dark, you've got to remove the plastic surface before you can start cleaning the object. So it adds a level of complexity to the cleaning of the thing.
I see.
So my feelings about that is, if you're dealing with outdoor bronzes and the sort, and you have a choice between letting the patination protect it or letting the incrolac, which is the name of the material I'm describing, protect it, I'd let the corrosion product, because it's much easier to maintain. And you can put things like wax on it that will help preserve it even more, because it keeps the water from sitting on the surface. I'm sorry, think about any of these sorts of topics, you can dive real deep into them. My tendency is to dive deep, and I don't want to get too deep into these sorts of things. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it actually, it does.
Good.
Yeah.
Well,
Good.
Larry, I want to tell you, I know all of us are so appreciative, because we really admire and honor and cherish your expertise in and really concern in conserving and keeping our history of everything alive and in good shape for the years to come. And it's just so, we're so lucky and privileged to have you working on our collection. So I'm sure we'll have more questions in the future. And I know that if people do have questions, they can certainly email me and I can reach out to you again. We work very closely. And I want to thank you so much for this really enlightening behind the scenes, so to speak, but really upfront and important of the scene presentation. Margie, did you want to just say something?
Well, just to add to that, I think you are a treasure. You're one of our treasures in the museum.
Oh, you're very kind.
And there's a certain magic about what you do when there's an object that's damaged, and you bring it back to life. That's great.
Well,
And you make our exhibits look wonderful. So it's been a great collaboration for the temple and the museum committee and the museum. I just want to mention that the next art talk, right, Sue, is December 7th at 2:00. It is Sue's going to talk about some of the wonderful Chanukkiot in the collection. And people can also bring to it a favorite Chanukkia that you have that might have a family story. And I always want to thank Candy for being so dedicated and sending out the reminders to all of the art talks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Candy. And to Jen. Thank you for being our host, Jen.
Thank you, Jen.
yeah, that was great.
This was fun. This was really
Happy to help.
Great.
Good.
Another successful art talk. Fantastic.
Thank you.
And we did record, so if anybody missed it, we recorded it.
Super.
I want to know if at Larry's house you ever get to throw out an old coffee mug. Or do you have to repair them all the time?
It depends on the mug, but they tend to last. I'll glue them back together if they're not.
Yeah,
really-
I figure you could never get rid of something.
It
You
looks
know
like
how
a
to
tour-
repair it.
Yeah, it looks like a tour of your house would be a good program.
Oh, I don't know. It's hard to get through. It's pretty crowded with stuff. So, but that would be fun.
Very nice look, very cool looking.
Great. Well, thanks, guys.
It
Very
was
Thank
so
you so
nice.
much.
Mhm.
It was so nice to meet you, Larry.
No, it's my
Who
pleasure.
always speaks of you so well.
Yeah,
Oh, very
the
kind.
face behind the legend.
I'm not a legend yet. Very good. But it is a pleasure, and I really do feel this is a community that is, I love being a part of it. So thank you for that. It's been a real treat, and very good. I'll look forward to seeing you all and having a chance to talk with you again. A real, especially in these circumstances, very lovely. I'm glad you guys are doing this.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Everybody be
Bye.
healthy and well.
Yeah, shalom
Yeah.
all.
Shalom.